Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Ambassador Bellamy, for your kind introduction. I am impressed by the diversity of that I see before me of the number of people that came from a variety of different places all across the globe to deal with this common interest that we all have. What I want to talk to you a little bit about, and then I do want to have some questions and answers. And if there are no questions, I know at the beginning of a conference, sometimes people are reluctant to ask questions. So I'm going to threaten to call on people, starting with the people that I know, if there are no questions. So, so make sure you have some. But what I am going to talk about first is the threat as we see it in the Department of Defense from counter-narcotics. Then give you a little bit of history of how we have seen this threat evolve and how we see it today. And then talk a little bit about the way that we have addressed the threat, the lessons that we have learned, and what our priorities are right now. So first let's talk about the threat. At one level, there are three different kinds of threats that we talk about when we discuss counter-narcotics. The first is the one that, that most people think of immediately, which is the health threat to all of our people from the scourge of narcotics and the damage that it does to people's families, to their lives even. And it's something that we all have to always keep in mind, even as we address this issue from a national security perspective, that that's what drives most people's interest in narcotics. The second issue is the national security issue, which is the damage that the organizations who traffic in narcotics do to the state, the threat that they pose to nations, to their sovereignty, beyond simple questions of rule of law. The fundamental threat that they give to, that they present to those interested in national security, both in our case, both the United States and our friends and allies abroad. And the third issue is also a national security threat and is the more evolving one, which is the means by which narcotics and the mechanisms and the networks that, that have facilitated narcotics trade for so long provide sustenance, logistics, and help to other threats that we face, to insurgencies, to terrorist organizations, to rogue states and harmful actors around the world. So those are three different kinds of threats, all related to each other, but all important to think about together. The two statements that were done within the last year that's important here in the United States. One is that the President of the United States last year announced a transnational organized crime strategy. And this was the first strategy in roughly 15 years that had been announced by a President of the United States. And just like the last strategy, which was done in 1998, this strategy came on the heels of a thorough intelligence assessment of the problem that we were facing, of the threat that we were facing. And what our assessment concluded after a great deal of work was that in those intervening 15 years, the problem had changed dramatically, both in size and in scope. In a globalized, networked world, the challenges that we were confronting from transnational organized crime as a whole and the narcotics trade as a very large percentage of that had really evolved to creating what the President decided was a clear threat to U.S. national security. That's one. The second statement that I want to highlight was done just a couple of weeks ago when General Clapper, who's our Director for National Intelligence, had to testify in front of our Congress in open session about what the largest threats were that he saw. And he went through all of the threats that one would expect him to talk about. But he took particular note of what he called the growing links between terrorist organizations and criminal organizations. And I want to pause on that just for a moment, because we see sort of, four different dynamics that are very important. The first is terrorist organizations that are using criminal activities, illicit activities, to fund their organizations, to provide logistics for their organization in a way that at one level has happened for a long period of time, but at another level is accelerating and is different than it has been before. Nowhere is this perhaps more pronounced than organizations such as Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Those are the words of Director Clapper 2 weeks ago. The second dynamic is criminal organizations that are adopting terrorist techniques. The criminal organizations that are driven by profit in, say, Mexico did not come up with the idea of beheading somebody and taking a videotape of it and putting it up on the internet. They saw terrorist organizations do that, but they immediately concluded that that kind of technique would be applicable in their case as well, and they started to do it. So it's the second one is criminal organizations adopting terrorist techniques, just like in the first one, terrorist organizations adopting criminal techniques. The third dynamic is previously completely unrelated terrorist organizations and criminal organizations starting to work together, at least tactically, at least opportunistically. Perhaps nothing for the United States demonstrated this better than an assassination attempt against the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, D.C., not too far from where we are right now, that elements in Iran were trying to do, and they were trying to use the Mexican Zetas drug cartel. That's a dynamic that I would wager that if you go back just 1 year and you ask a lot of experts on the question, is such a thing going to happen? You would have a lot of people say, no, absolutely not. These are completely different organizations. They have nothing in common. Why would they work together? But this was a dynamic where we saw evidence of that. And then the fourth issue that I want to discuss is states that use crime, including narcotics trafficking, as a tool of the state. And states like North Korea have been doing this for a long period of time. This is a little different than states being corrupted to a degree by narcotics, as I talked about before, about the threats to the state. This is a state making a conscious decision to use the tools of crime as a tool of the state. And we see that dynamic happening in the world as well. So you add it all up, and what you see is quite a challenge, not just for people who think about narcotics and health, and not just for people who think about narcotics in terms of law enforcement, but to people who think about narcotics and the wider transnational organized crime from a national security perspective. And that's our responsibility inside the Department of Defense, and I assume the responsibility of many of you in the audience as well. Perhaps I'll just give you one quick example without belaboring it too much, but something that made news just a few months ago that illustrates the trend that we're talking about. And it was a big New York Times article, and maybe even we could get it for everyone in the audience. That came out in December, and it was about Hezbollah. And what it was about was an effort that started at the beginning of last year with some sanctions efforts and ended, it's still ongoing, but ended at the end of last year with indictments in U.S. court and a civil action for hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. court. And here's the basic story. The basic story was drugs were being trafficked from Latin America to West Africa into Europe. The money for these drugs was in part being laundered through a series of used car dealerships inside the United States that were moving used cars to West Africa. and a very, very large number of used cars. I mean, I've seen the pictures of literally hundreds of thousands of cars. Millions and millions of dollars being moved and laundered through two sets of criminal activities by one network. At the end of the day, that network was helping to fund Hezbollah, and was doing so through, in part at least, through a bank called Lebanese Canadian Bank in Beirut. It's that bank that we sanctioned. There was identifying it, the Treasury Department identified it as a bank of primary money laundering concern. There was an instant run on the bank, as we anticipated. The bank was near collapse. And in the end of the day, sold to Société Générale. And Hezbollah was significantly affected. And just as important, in some ways even more important, from my perspective, about a month later, we started to see op-eds and columns in local Beirut business newspapers from bankers. And these bankers quite openly said, you know, when Hezbollah started to get involved in our banking system, we all knew it was happening, and we decided that it didn't affect us. And now what we see is that it can affect us. It can destroy our banks. And if it's a choice between the banking system on one hand and Hezbollah's terrorist activities on another hand, we choose the banking system. And so we have to stand up to these people in our midst and in our companies. That's the kind of dynamic that you want to develop, of people standing up to people that will abuse them for criminal actions. That's the dynamic. That's the new world in which we are, which we're seeing. Criminal activities, drug activities, terrorist actions, all coming together. And let's take a moment to think about the scale of this. While people in the United States have been talking about drugs and the challenge of drugs for a long time, and we should remember back in the 1980s, this was, for Americans in the audience, you'll remember this was the #1 thing on television shows like Miami Vice and movies like Scarface. So at some level, I think there are many Americans who see this as old news, but it's not old news. According to the UN numbers, the size of the global drug trafficking is roughly the size of the crude oil business around the world. It's a massive amount of money. And if past is prologue, as a number of other countries develop their middle classes, as they get wealthier, what unfortunately, unless they take very strong actions on the outset, what unfortunately will be the case is that there will be greater demand for drugs. And so we can expect this problem, as large as it is, to get bigger. And the sheer size of it is also the reason why when other organizations go to look for who knows how to move something from one place to another, who knows how to move people, who knows how to move money, who knows how to move weapons, you typically find that the expertise is held by the drug trafficking organizations that are there locally, and so that's who they go to. That's a threat that we face. Now, what do we do about it? Let me talk to you about 5 things, really. I want to talk to you about how we have addressed this inside the United States and the direct threat to the United States starting a couple of decades ago. I want to talk about Colombia. I want to talk a little bit about Mexico. I want to talk a little bit about West Africa. And I want to talk a little bit about Afghanistan. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but I just want to talk about those 5 things very briefly, and then I'm more than happy to answer any questions again. First, in the United States, if I go back to the time that I was describing before in the 1980s, 75% of all the drugs that were coming into the United States were coming in directly into Florida. Little planes, little boats across the Caribbean from Colombia. We're landing in little coves. We're landing in small little landing strips that got set up quickly, that got taken up quickly. It's a huge expanse of area in Florida. And this was perceived to be an insurmountable problem. It was too hard. And if you go back to the debates inside the United States at that time, no one really knew what to do with it. The law enforcement community was completely overwhelmed. And the conclusion was reached that this wasn't just a law enforcement problem, that this was a national security problem, because we fundamentally did not have power over our own borders. And so the Department of Defense was asked to play a role. And previously, before that, the U.S. Department of Defense did not play a role. And the role was twofold. There's only one part of this whole mission set where the Department of Defense is the lead, where the military has the lead. And that is detecting and monitoring the movement of illicit drugs into the United States through the air and maritime domains. For that mission, the military was given the lead. The military was responsible for setting up radar sites, for bringing together and fusing all the information, and for identifying where the bad guys were and where they were moving. For every other aspect of the mission, the Defense Department, the military, is a supporting entity. It's law enforcement that is the supported entity that has the lead. And that's a very important distinction here in the United States. What we did is we created, after some fits and starts, and there was lots of painful learning along the ways. So while I'm telling you these very quick stories about the United States, I do have to say with some humility, we made a great number of mistakes over the years. Through those mistakes, we've come up with some relatively successful solutions, but it's important also to recognize that we didn't come up with the solution immediately. We had to learn through painful experience. But we set up the Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, Florida. And that group brought everybody together, brought in all the information from all different sources, to get investigatory information, to identify that they hear from a confidential source that a plane is about to take off in Venezuela, to the radar information of tracking different planes, to getting an interdiction asset that might belong to a law enforcement agency or might belong to, say, the Honduran Navy, to take action. And the person in charge of this is not a member of the Department of Defense. It's a Coast Guard admiral, which is part of, in our system, the Department of Homeland Security, and that's very important to us. This has been tremendously successful, and what I will say is that whereas, if you remember before, I said in the 1980s and 90s, 75% of all the drugs that came into the United States were coming in directly through the air and maritime domains into Florida. Now that's less than 1%. We've effectively stopped this problem that previously was considered insurmountable. The other thing I'll note is that at this point, the traffickers stay in the air and maritime domain as short a period as they possibly can. Their objective is to stay out of the air and stay away from the water coming towards the United States, because they know that we have an ability to get them. Roughly 1% of the time that cocaine moves between Colombia, elsewhere in the Andes, and the United States, 1% of that time is in the air and maritime domain. And yet, in that 1% of the time, we disrupt 8 times as much cocaine as we do on our border and across the entire United States. So it's quite an effective operation. The key lesson that we learned in this dynamic, in this experience of building Jihad of South, is the requirement to work together across all the agencies of our government, work together in a networked way with our partners, other nations around the world. We found quite painfully that the Department of Defense could not succeed on its mission on the basis of Department of Defense authorities and capabilities alone. The only way to succeed is to work with all of our interagency partners and international partners. That is challenging, that is difficult, that is painful. Every single day, it's much easier if you can just do everything all by yourself. But it's the only way that we've achieved this kind of success. We learned this lesson again in Colombia. And here, I would argue it's the greatest national security success for any country anywhere around the world in the last 10 years has been the success that Colombia has had in its efforts against the FARC. And again, let's just remember where we were. I remember seeing a poll in the late 90s that said that 2/3 of the Colombian people believed that the FARC was going to take Bogota and the government was going to fall. Let me tell you, 2/3 of Afghans do not think that the Taliban is going to take Kabul right now. This was, by many measures, a much, much worse situation in Colombia about 15 years ago. Now the FARC is a shadow of what it was. The state has expanded its authority across in places that it never before had. And while there are many, many problems and many challenges in Colombia, the government has had tremendous success by any stretch of the imagination, by any way that you want to look at it. It's a much better place today than it was before. What the U.S. government had to learn through that process is how to best support other countries that are making the right decisions about how to go after an insurgency that is fundamentally funded through narcotics trafficking. The FARC was both an insurgency and a terrorist organization and the world's largest narco-trafficking ring. And the way that you do that, again, the way that Colombians found to do that is by working together, by the whole of government, by all the agencies coming together in a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy and a comprehensive anti-network, attack the network strategy. And it's been tremendously successful. And the Department of Defense had to learn how to support from behind. We were not active participants in that effort, but we did provide a great deal of resources and training to help the Colombians. Because of the success in Colombia, what we have seen in the United States is two dynamics. One is that actual amount of cocaine coming to the United States has been going down. And the usage rates in the United States has actually plateaued and even started to go down. And the price of cocaine is higher and the purity is much lower. So we've had a real effect on the streets of the United States. That's the good news. There are two other bad news, unfortunately, and this is the nature of this work, is that as we move the cocaine trade out of the Caribbean, it's gone more towards Central America and Mexico. And so now we are actively working in support of the Mexicans who are dealing with a very, very challenging situation. And once again, our role is to support them in their sovereign decisions about how they want to fight this war. Their military, their president has asked their military to be the lead organization, and the Mexican military is fighting very valiantly, very courageously against a very challenging set of adversaries. Similar situations in Central America. The other dynamic, because of success, is that a lot of other countries who are becoming larger, in relative terms, larger cocaine producers than Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, are not choosing to send their cocaine to the United States, but are choosing to send their cocaine elsewhere. The European market is the largest and it is one of the fastest growing markets. It's the largest untapped market for them. And again, this is according to UN numbers. You see the results of this new trend. Brazil, where a lot of the cocaine is moving through, has now become we're still the largest aggregate user of cocaine in the world because of our size, but Brazil is the second largest aggregate user of cocaine in the world. And the largest per capita users of cocaine are the United Kingdom and Spain. And that is a dynamic that we've never seen before. And that's bad for Western Europe, but frankly, it's even worse for West Africa, which is in the way. And the real challenge for states in West Africa, I don't have to tell you, for those of you who are from West Africa, is the sheer size and scale of the resources, of the money, of the corrupting influence that comes with this trade is extremely problematic. And we've seen this before in the Caribbean. When you have relatively small countries, it's very hard to defeat these kinds of challenges. And frankly, it's impossible to do so alone. And so we need to help, the Europeans need to help West Africa deal with this challenge. The other thing that I would say is one of the classic errors that we see all around the world is a given country. We saw it in the Caribbean, we saw it in Central America, and there are questions in some places on West Africa. Countries make the decision, well, this isn't really affecting my country. It's just transiting through my country. So this isn't something that I have to really deal with. I have yet to see, in my understanding of the history of the world on this issue, that strategy ever succeeding. There is no such thing as a transit country being a transit country only. A transit countries inevitably always become user countries. They always see their institutions corrupted. They always see it evolve to a national security threat. The only question is whether one deals with this threat from the outset, where it might be a manageable threat, or whether it deals with this problem at the end of the process after it is clearly a threat, in fact, maybe the primary threat to national security. The last thing I just want to talk about quickly, because I'm conscious of time, is Afghanistan. Here, the United States has had to directly confront a military adversary, the Taliban, that is also a massive drug trafficking organization. The largest proportion of its resources are drawn from the drug trade. 90+% of the world's heroin comes out of Afghanistan. That heroin is concentrated tremendously in the parts of Afghanistan that the Taliban controls or influences. That is not an accident. And so the United States, for the first time, has had to wage a military campaign against this kind of adversary. And we've employed lots of the lessons that we learned in support of Colombia and elsewhere. And again, the key conclusion is the need to do this in cooperation, in a whole-of-government effort, in full cooperation of law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies, and in full cooperation with, of course, the Afghan capabilities, Afghan law enforcement, Afghan military. And here, we are starting to have effect. It frankly took us too long to apply these lessons. As late as the end of 2008, our military forces in Afghanistan did not believe they had the authority to target a drug trafficking network. That was allied directly with the Taliban. We changed that. Now they go against what we call the nexus of networks, of insurgency, of terrorism, of narcotics, of corrupt criminal patronage networks, to have the desired effect using the right tool, the military tool, or law enforcement tool, or other tools. Once again, as we say in the Department of Defense, we've concluded that it takes a network to defeat a network. And that's how we have to approach this issue. Thank you very much. I'll end there. I spanned a great deal of issues, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.